Welcome to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. In this episode, we'll be listening to Bookstore Policies for Free Expression, a session that was presented at Children's Institute 2026 in Schaumburg, Illinois.
We're here to talk about bookstore policies for free expression. I'll go through some of the front matter in a second, but just to make sure that you're in the right place and know what to listen for, the basic idea of this panel is that policy can help you be prepared, that having the right policies written out in advance that you can use to train your staff can help you know what to do when someone is trying to silence you because of your curation, your events, anything like that, any kind of active expression that you as a store are doing. So we're going to go through a few specific policies, and we'll have a little bit of time for you to actually start thinking through it with your store in mind and talking with a neighbor, because, you know, I'm a former writing teacher. I can't do anything without doing some write and share with your neighbor, right? But first I want to make sure that people have some resources. The sort of online version of what I'm going through today, as well as so many other things that have the same goal in mind, can be found at our most recent toolkit, which is about navigating bookstore harassment, threats, and intimidation. You can find it on bookweb.org. There's also a QR code here. You will be able to find the slides here, as well as some other resources, including a recording of the talk on Bookweb and on the podcast Book Ed. I don't know. I still don't know. Booked or Book Ed, Courtney, I don't know. Could be anything. Silence your cell phones, or don't, but if it goes off, I will make fun of you. And when we get to the question section, please do wait for the mic. I have no doubt that you can project your voice, but it is for the recording and it's for anyone. It helps with access as well. So it's very important to wait for the mic. Briefly, antitrust guidelines. We're not going to talk about pricing or pricing policies. We're not going to talk about boycotts. We're not going to talk about dividing up the market. So policies. You can't have a policy for everything. Case in point. We're going to talk about what we mean by these policies and why you might want to have one. We're going to talk about 4 specific types of policies that you might want to think about: a mission statement, a value statement, a curation policy, and a code of conduct. As we said, we're going to brainstorm and start talking through them for your store. And then we'll touch briefly on how to use these policies, how to apply them in your store once you have them. And then we'll go over some resources. Speaking of resources, this is also linked in the toolkit, but there is a sort of specific version for you to go through at your own pace on Bookweb. There's a QR code to that. Or if you go to bookweb.org/advocacy, or our toolkit linked before, you should be able to find it as well. So don't feel like you have to be, you'll get the slides, you'll get the recording, you'll get the online version. Take notes on what helps you, but don't feel like that's your only chance to get it. All right, so let's go with the basics. What do I mean when I say a policy? A written set of guidelines. It's important that it's written. It is important for reasons that I'll get into, like you want to think through it in advance. You want to kind of have everything laid out for yourself when things are calm. You want to be able to share it with your staff, with your customers, with management, with whoever it applies to, right? It can speak to any of those different audiences. It can be a set of rules. It can be a guiding principle. It can be a social contract. All of that depends on what you need it to do. But the policy, when you're starting to conceive of it, you want to think of who is it for and what is it meant to do. Again, here, why write it? Because it forces you to think through it systematically. Because you need to be able to coordinate decision-making and offer guidance in difficult situations. And that is going to require you to have something that you can share and use for training, whether it's training your staff, training yourself, training your co-owners, whatever. But also, and this is something that I think people don't think about often enough, is that having a written policy can actually shield staff from complaints and help them deal with pressure. Unfortunately, we've seen in recent years an escalation in people being recorded, people, kind of baiting someone into maybe saying something that in a way that they wouldn't say it, but emotions are high and they say something in a very polemical way, shall we say, right? And unbeknownst to them, someone is recording, and that's intentional. We've had booksellers be recorded, put on YouTube, cut together in unflattering ways for rage bait videos that are then monetized with ad revenue. It becomes kind of a cottage industry for some people. So we really need to spread awareness of that so that people understand, hey, it's actually about protecting yourself to not take the bait. It's not about, you not being a fully realized version of yourself or needing to like stand up to someone. It's a trap, right? Perfect example, perfect opportunity for an Admiral Akbar from Star Wars. It's a trap. GIF. Next time. But it is a trap, and so having these policies in place and actually training people, you're letting them have something else to refer to. You're giving them something where they can say, "Hey, that's a little bit above my pay grade. I'm going to refer you to our curation policy, or if you have more questions, you can check out our policies, or I can take." I can give you an email address for our owner or whoever, right? So as you're starting to think about these different policies that we're going to go through, I'm going to frame each of them as well with a question. And the reason is to kind of give you a starting point, but then also to kind of help you do that reflective exercise of thinking about what each of these things means for your store. And I'll get into each question individually, starting with a mission statement. What is your purpose? I don't mean to start any existential crises. That's, it's not quite late enough in the day for that yet. But thinking about what is your purpose as a store is a good way to think about your mission statement. And okay, one of you is at least thinking our mission is to sell books. Like, I know, thank you, smartass. Yes, but what else can you say? Right? And moreover, how do you want to distinguish yourself as an independent bookstore from all of the other incredible independent bookstores that are gathered here that are maybe in your area? What else can you say about how you make some of those really difficult decisions of, given you have a limited amount of shelf space, given that you have a limited amount of space in your events calendar, given that you have a limited amount of capital to buy books with, right? How are you going to make those decisions? What are the principles that you use to guide you? Or if you want to zoom out a little bit, what is your identity as a bookstore? That's not necessarily going to be the same as what is your identity as an individual. Those often overlap. There are many Black-owned bookstores that specialize in books by Black authors. There are many queer-owned bookstores that specialize in books by queer people. But sometimes it will be, hey, this is a sci-fi bookstore. That's what we do, right? Sometimes it will be, so many other things. So don't think of it as an about me section necessarily, though that's often part of it. Think of it as a what do you do and why do you do it? When we're thinking about mission statements, I think it can be helpful to break it down into several different types of store. So a generalist bookstore might approach its mission statement with thinking about, what are you driven by community interest? Maybe you are especially focused on new releases. Maybe you really want to be a place that is a repository for the classics. Maybe that's important to you. Maybe you want to make sure that as a generalist bookstore, you have a really robust children's section, right? Because that's, maybe you want to make sure that it takes up half of your floor space or something like that. Anything like that might be an unarticulated logic by which you approach your curation. This is a chance for you to bring that to the surface and communicate it to people. If you're a specialist bookstore focusing on or emphasizing a certain subject matter, there's something distinct in the way that you shelve books. There's a bookstore just north of Milwaukee. I'm blanking on its name right now. Maybe Ray will remember it. I feel like you were there. He wasn't paying attention. Always when I give him a shout out. But it was books that were shelved by region along with wines that were from that region. Were you there at that show, Ray? Maybe not. But it was great. It was between in Madison. Well, it's too bad the internet doesn't exist, so I can't figure it out. But it was, but that's a really, really interesting thing for a generalist bookstore. That it's about how they shelve things. I'm thinking of McNally Jackson as well, right? They famously have this really interesting shelving principle. So that is also based on region. Or maybe there's something in your curation where you're like, we're a romance bookstore. Here's what that means to us, right? And maybe you're an activist bookstore, right? Maybe your thing is being driven by a particular social mission. Articulating that mission, articulating why a bookstore is the place to pursue that mission can be so, so, so important. That can be about representation. It can be about a certain political cause. It can be about creating a space for a local community. Creating a third space is an activist mission, right? It's something about healing the social fabric that I think can be extremely important. So I do have some examples for each of these types. I do want to say, Lisa, I didn't know you would be here when I pulled Buffalo Street books. I pulled these examples mostly by people I was confident wouldn't be mad at me because I forgot to ask permission. So Lisa, please forgive me. And Greenlight too. Hey. So yeah, totally. I got caught. But there are a few things. I'm not going to read each of these examples in full. But let's look at Greenlight, I think, is a really good example of, the equity and sustainability of the company and community, right? Very much a generalist bookstore. I think that's safe to say, you have a little bit of everything, but there's still something really important in that act of trying to explain what you're about. Buffalo Street books, I wanted to include not just because I didn't think Lisa would be mad at me, but because the nonprofit model is so important to what you all do. And I think that this is a really great example of articulating what that allows you to do, right? Looking at some specialist examples, the Legendarium, amazing sci-fi fantasy bookstore, and as well as horror in Salt Lake City. What's really important to them is a combination of genre focus and identity, right? They're queer and trans owned and led, and they're really leaning into sci-fi fantasy and tabletop games, right? So it's a tight mission statement, but it kind of immediately tells you what this space is about. Meet Cute, similarly, the reason I wanted to include this was because it says, romance. So what does that mean to us? How does that impact our stock, right? So they have contemporary, historical, paranormal, going through all of these things to kind of communicate to the romance fan as well as the person who maybe is new to the genre. But then also having this really moving final sentence where they're kind of talking about it a little bit more conceptually as well. Activist examples. Those of you who are at the opening keynote saw the amazing Leah Johnson. This is her store, Loudmouth Books. What I love about this is it's voicey, right? As Leah's personality is really coming through even in the mission statement. So you can have fun with it. It doesn't need to be this dry thing. But Leah's also just really kind of getting into the community part of it, as well as that fundamental mission of increasing access to diverse literature. And finally, Firestorm, the amazing Firestorm book collective, anarchist book collective, queer feminist owned. Really, really interesting here in terms of maintaining a welcoming, sober, and anti-oppressive space. Sober, I think, is a really interesting word to include there, which I believe they mean in terms of like alcohol and substances. Sober spaces, that's one reason that people go to bookstores in many cases. No offense, book bars, right? I mean, book bars are wonderful. I love them. And there are a lot of people who are specifically seeking places to go that can be sober. So it's really, really interesting. The kind of space they're creating really overlaps with their political mission in a really wonderful way. So if you're hearing all this, you might be thinking like mission statement, value statement. There's a huge amount of overlap between those two things. I would say that a value statement, I think of almost as potentially a more internal document, kind of giving yourself a North Star, where if you're making a difficult decision, what are the principles that you want to check in with as a staff, as a store, as an owner to make those decisions? So in other words, what is important to you? It doesn't need to be explicit. Maybe this is something you do want to put on your website to have to refer people to. Maybe it's something that you just want to go through the exercise of creating. Either, I think, can be really, really useful. But the kinds of values that you might want to think about are community values. How do you fit into your local community? Do you want your curation to come out of a kind of dialogue like that? Do you want to try to reflect the diversity of your area? There's this amazing bookstore in Jackson Heights, Queens, called the World's Borough Books. The owner, when I was talking to him, said that they try to have books from every language spoken in Jackson Heights, which is incredible. And also, if you've ever been to Jackson Heights, is incredibly difficult, right? It's basically all languages, right? It's kind of a tiny bookstore that is also a Tower of Babel, essentially. But things like that, I think, are really interesting. What does it mean to reflect your community in particular? In terms of political values, some stores want to be neutral, some stores want to be opinionated. Both are great. It's just about what you want your store to be. Both absolutely have their purpose and serve their role. That said, most stores do have some kinds of red lines that they don't cross, which are articulated or not articulated. I would encourage you to at least articulate them to yourself so that you know what they are. And if you're saying that you don't have red lines, really test that, because I don't think you don't want to find out that you do when you've already acted on them, right? So it's just worth kind of really having that dialogue with yourself. But I don't want to lose, when we talk about values, I think people often think about just political values. Literary value matters, right? I don't think that's a hard sell in this room, I hope. Maybe it's about prose or poetry, fiction or nonfiction in terms of where you place your emphasis. Maybe you want to have some of everything. But maybe you really want to challenge people with having a super wide range of styles. Maybe you want to, be that gateway to classics and bestsellers. Maybe it's really driven, maybe you're a tiny store and it's really driven by your own taste, right? And that's part of what the kind of curation that you want to do. Consider that, right? If there's something there that you want to communicate it. I want to make a note about value statements that I think they can sometimes be received as performative, or they can sometimes be received as performative allyship. And I think that's worth thinking about, right? But when something is called performative, it's not the fact that it is performed, it's the fact that it is not lived up to in some way. So if you are making a value statement, it's worth taking a moment and saying, what do I actually have to do to live up to that? If I'm going to, kind of have the everyone is welcome here in rainbow letters, how am I standing up and really making a safe space for the queer community in my area? If you're doing similarly, kind of talking about, pro-immigrant spaces, like we're being a pro-immigrant space, what does that mean? How are you actually embodying that? So in terms of performativity, that's what I would say, is don't limit what you say necessarily, but think hard about what it means to live up to it. The curation policy I want to say is the policy that made me want to do this session, because I kept telling people like, hey, make a curation policy. And we had some examples on our site, but I realized it was a much bigger question. And I realized that in order to really have a curation policy, in many cases, you needed those other two policies first, a values statement and a mission statement, right? And because many times what you're saying is, our curation is meant to forward those values or lift up those values. But if you don't know what they are, how are you going to lead with those, right? So I think I would encourage you to, this I think in many ways is the most important statement for you to come away from this session with, is some thoughts towards a curation statement. But I started with the other two because I think they lead into it. So the reason I think a curation policy is so important is because increasingly we're seeing people come into bookstores and think that it is like a school library or a public library, something that everyone has some ability to challenge the inclusion of a book, I have great news. They don't, right? Nobody gets to tell you what is on your shelves. Nobody gets to tell you what you shouldn't have, and nobody gets to force you to carry something that you don't want to carry, right? It's important for people to understand the First Amendment is not just about not censoring people. It's about not compelling people to carry certain messages that they don't want to, right? And rightly or wrongly, for better or worse, your curation is often received by your customers and by your community as a speech act that you're making. Not necessarily that you endorse every book, right? But that curation is you saying, this is something that I want to put in front of you that I want to have in our store. And so you have every right to make those decisions in any way that you want. People don't always like to hear that, right? And having a curation policy is one way to kind of get the whole team on the same page, but it's also a way for if someone says, why do you carry this book? It's blah, blah, blah. It's blah, blah, blah. Or why don't you have 50 copies of this book or that book? You can say, well, we don't have 50 copies of anything because unless we're having an event, and even then, maybe not. But also, here's our curation policy. You're asking a question. Here's an answer. It's on our website. You can go and sort of see how we make those decisions. That doesn't mean it's up for debate, but there's the information, the spirit of transparency. Having those policies written is extremely helpful for you to, again, figure out what those red lines are, but also figure out where you want to put your effort in terms of finding things that are in your store, right? So what does it mean to have the values and to have your mission expressed in your book buying? But it's a policy that nobody knows about is useless. Worse than useless, it's a waste of time, right? You need to use the policy to have something to refer to when you're making those decisions, but also to train staff. Also, if it's appropriate for your store, to have it on the website, to have ways that you can, to make it easy for yourself to refer people to it. Ideally, you would use it in staff training and even potentially some like role playing, right? In terms of someone coming in and saying, why are you carrying, this book or that book? I don't know, Philip Pullman or whatever, right? And figuring out what it feels like for each staff member to kind of find their own language in that while sticking to that policy. When you're making that policy, think about what does it mean, again, for your mission and values to come through in curation. If you are a store with a strong social mission, how do you balance the sales with the social mission? Because, don't want to ruin anybody's day, but we do live under capitalism. Most people have to pay rent in some way or another. And it's not, it's not a knock on your social mission to also need to stay open, right? And similarly, many places will also just really need to kind of do both and think about them as separate parts of the mission. Do you have any different guidelines when you're curating events as opposed to books, right? Maybe for books, you want to have some of everything, but maybe for events, you really want to focus on bestsellers, or maybe for events, you really want to focus on community events. I was recently talking to Jules Wernersbach of Hive Mind Books and newly the Bureau of General Services Queer Division, which they acquired to save it, to stop it from going out of business. And Jules' policy is, hey, come in. It's an open door. This is a community space. If we can host you, we're going to. And also, this is what this space is. You have to be cool with that, right? But as long as you know that, we're a space for you. That is not the same as I would say, as what their policy is for book curation. They're more focused. They're more specialist and activist in that sense. But there's not a one-size-fits-all policy here, right? Curation, even for stores with similar formats, with similar missions, they're not necessarily going to approach it in the same way. And again, I've broken it out into some different paradigms that I think are useful to think about. So let's say that you're maybe a generalist bookstore says, listen, we want to be essentially an open window, open door, clear window, whatever. We want to try to represent all major sides of every major issue. We want to be a place that is a forum, right, where you can come to find opinions that you disagree with. Or agree with, I guess. So some sample language for that kind of approach. You might see a store whose mission statement or curation statement says, we believe a healthy society is an informed society, or every perspective has a place, or so you'll definitely find something here to offend you because our shelves offend everyone. Maybe you want to get people beyond their echo chambers. So some of you have probably heard this kind of language before. It probably resonates with some of you, rankles others. There are definitely pros and cons here. Benefits is it lets you draw on a traditional defense of free speech as a civic virtue. I think people are newly in touch with that right now. I think as its limits are being, shall we say, tested, I think it lets you appeal to those First Amendment ideals, and it lets you potentially be a space for people of many different political persuasions to encounter each other, to actually kind of see each other in physical space. Again, probably sounds great to some of you and horrible to others. Everyone gets to do their own thing. Because there are drawbacks to this, right? Neutrality in this climate in particular can lead to a lot of criticism, which may be justified. Many people also, as I said, have an unstated red line. And when they're saying that they want to have all sides of every major issue, one, that's not necessarily really possible in terms of just space limitations, but two, there might be a limit to that they haven't fully conceived, and then that can get them in a tough spot, right, if they're having to defend themselves. But I'll also say that moral relativism is not super popular, right? I mean, for good reasons. I think a lot of people think like, hey, if you're saying that you can represent everything, that you're going to platform everything, then that's a tough one for me, right? And people will be put off by that. And that's an interesting conversation, but it's one that you want to be ready for. I think many stores, because of particularly because of the moral relativism thing, opt instead to reflect a worldview that feels authentic to them, right? To them as owners, as a team, as the community that they seek to represent. And I want to just say as clearly as possible, this is every bit as legitimate from a free expression perspective as saying we want to be a space where every idea is represented. To say we have an opinion, we are expressing that opinion, our curation is our expression, that is absolutely valid. I think it is helpful, especially in this case, to articulate that that's what you're doing, because if people are coming in and expecting you to be a library, right, which has a different responsibility to reflect every perspective, they are going to think that they have a right to say like, hey, you only have these books and not these books. If you have this book, you have to have this book. You really don't. But again, communicating that ahead of time can be really helpful. Sample language here would be our curation reflects our values. The values statement is really helpful to have in this case. We uplift causes we believe in, like X and Y. We're opinionated. That means we're not for everyone. That's okay. All of these things are things that I've seen in people's mission statements and that work for them. Again, here there are benefits and drawbacks. Increasingly, especially just given how fundamental some of the issues are these days that people are really concerned about, people want to spend money with folks who share their values. It's okay to lean into that, and it's okay to not want to take part in that, right? Whatever your approach is, I think both are valid. This, as I said, will set you apart from libraries, which libraries are great. I love libraries. And bookstores can specialize in a way that libraries can't. Like that's a superpower, actually. This is one of the ways to develop your store's personality and identity. But it's also, if you're drawing in those who share the values, you're going to be pushing away those who don't. So you want to be realistic about that and ready for that. That might sound great to you. That's totally fine. I think that sometimes people will say, well, I really actually want you to be a library, and I'm worried that y'all are the ones who are banning books. I think that's a dumb argument. I don't think it's true. I think choosing not to carry something is perfectly valid, and it's not the same as barring it from the public sphere, right? But you want to be ready for that conversation. And And, I think a lot of people would say that this approach risks furthering echo chambers or contributing to polarization. Whatever you think of that argument, again, I think you want to take it seriously, think through it, even if only to respond to it. And then finally, I would say that this third paradigm is that activist or specialist curation, right? That is really narrowing in on the impact that you want to have or the particular segment of the book world that you want to give voice to. These are stores with a defined mission. Sometimes their curation statements will be about identity. Sometimes it'll be about, again, that political impact. These are more kind of definitely not one size fits all, probably one size fits one, right? Like every store I think is going to need to approach it for themselves, but you'll know in that case what feels authentic to you. Sometimes though, there is some language that will come up that I've seen, like we exclusively stock or emphasize books that do this or, represent this identity. We want to be a gathering place for such and such. Our mission is to blank. We stock books that further that mission. Again, you really want to have a mission statement there. I think that sometimes people get turned off if people get turned off by the specialist bookstore or the activist bookstore. I think that what they're missing is that when you zoom out and think about the market as a whole, the book market as a whole, specialist bookstores are so important to have a space for maybe the backlist, the backlist queer book that maybe just barely has stayed in print and that you're not going to find in most generalist bookstores just because it is such a deep cut, right? The curation, right, it is actually such an incredible thing that specialist or really focused bookstores like that can add. And without that, there's not necessarily going to be a space for those books, right? So I think that this is something that this approach can really allow you to do, is to lean into your expertise, to lean into curation as something that you're adding not just for your immediate geographic community, but for a broader sense of community, right? So for example, at Winter Institute, I met, I think they're a mobile bookstore that is focused on books about disability and by people with disabilities, right? And they were talking about how it was such a difficult thing to do that curation precisely because nobody had done it before, right? But that was what they were adding, right? Is the selection of books, the kind of drawing those reading lists together, right? It was such an incredible and valuable thing that they're adding. I do think that this gives you a really clear identity, like in the examples that I was just mentioning. And it also allows you to say, like, if someone is complaining about something that you carry or don't carry, it's to say, essentially, like, hey, this is a Wendy's. Like, we don't do that, right? We do our one particular thing and we do it as well as possible. But what you're asking us to do would completely ruin that identity. But it also, you have to be realistic about how that's going to limit your customer base. See if there are things that you need to do to make sure that you're able to keep your doors open. I think that, maybe you start as one thing and over time you realize that you want to do more, that you want to, inhabit more things in your mission. That growth can be really important. But I also want to mention that depending on your mission, it can be really easy for trolls to target you. In particular, we've seen people go through and target any store that is leading with identity and to, maybe make harassing phone calls, make threats in some cases, really horrible threats. So be aware of that. Think about what your plan is. If you're going to be have your shingle out in a way that people are really able to see, make sure that you have the infrastructure to support yourself if something happens, right? And I want to make sure to emphasize, call ABA and ABFE. We can help if you're worried about going through something like that. We can walk you through the resources we have available. We can help you respond if some kind of harassment or intimidation like that happens. Finally, I want to touch on a code of conduct before we get into some free writing time and share with your neighbor. As I said, code of conduct, I think the question is, what is your social contract? What do people need to do? What kind of community do you want to create in your store? What kind of space do you want to maintain in your store? And what behavior needs to be encouraged or discouraged to make that happen? We live in a society. You get to say, hey, this is our space. We need to be, there need to be limits on how we can act towards each other. You have a right to insist on civil and respectful conduct. You need to protect your team. You need to protect your customers. You need to protect, to some extent, the invited guests, like authors and speakers. Having a code of conduct is actually a way of helping your staff navigate that and navigate that role that they have to kind of preserve that space. And having it written, having that as a policy, lets you train on it, right? Lets you actually think about, like, okay, here is our intention. What are the specific, concrete, actionable things that we need to do? And what are the roles that we need to assign anytime an event is happening or anytime something goes wrong in the store, right? What needs to happen and who's going to do it? So the code of conduct is important there because it's establishing those boundaries, right? And when you're thinking about those boundaries, think about, again, what are the values and intentions? Coming back to your values statement, that includes, by the way, making sure that a policy is going to be applied evenly. And you need to be thinking about, how do you counteract implicit bias in any kind of code of conduct stuff? Even if you think that you don't need it, one, challenge yourself on that. I think everybody has work that they can do there. But two, making sure that your staff and community are also helped to resist that implicit bias through that policy. Think about what you want to do in the case of disruption of business and events, harassment of staff and guests, what the boundaries of that harassment are and what the steps are that you can take. Dealing with sexual advances, stalking, threats, all of these things, unfortunately, are things that bookstores have to think about. And increasingly, as I mentioned before, unsanctioned recording, other invasions of privacy like that. Those are things that you need to understand what your local and state ordinances are there in terms of, can you forbid recording? States have different laws around it. I can't go through each state here, and I'm not a lawyer barred in 50 states or any states for that matter. And if any of those violations do happen, what are the options, right? What is your store's policy on, calling the police, for example? That's something that a lot of different people are going to have really different opinions on, and a lot of it is going to depend on your community and what is available in your area, right? There are resources for alternatives to the police, right? You want to know what those are ahead of time. If you need to have, if you think an event is going to potentially draw protests, you might want to think about security, right? If so, you want to know what that values-aligned security firm is before you need them, right? Try to vet them ahead of time before you have any reason to use them so that you know who to call. I think also having guidelines for what people can do if a violation occurs is going to help people not put themselves in harm's way, right? You, again, want to just have a de-escalatory focus in everything that you do. And there are de-escalation resources that you can find on BookWeb, previous sessions from previous institutes. So I want to take a step back. And again, we have 4 policies that we've gone over here: mission statement, value statement, curation policy, or code of conduct. Think about which of these you feel like your store could work on. It's okay if you're a frontline bookseller, you don't have the authority to make those decisions. That's okay. Nobody's getting told on here. You can think about the policies that you would want to work on, and that can still be a useful exercise. Maybe it's something you bring to management or to the owners. So think about which of these you most would like to work on, and just start jotting down some notes about what kind of approach you'd like to take. I'm going to go back to the QR code that takes you to the website so you can kind of look through some of the details and examples and stuff that I gathered. But I'll give you a few minutes to work on this, and then I'll encourage you to talk to the person next to you, bounce ideas off of each other, because maybe you're dealing with similar things. All right, so I'm going to go back to I'm going to go well, no, that's too small. I'll go back to the beginning. There we go. So that's the one that is on the website, is the version of all of these policies. Should give you a starting point, but pick a policy, make some notes, and then share with the person next to you. However far you've gotten, that's great. Hopefully it's given you a chance to start thinking through it. Chat with the people around you about what they focused on, what you focused on. Have a chance to just bounce those ideas off, because in many cases you're probably navigating the same things or interestingly different things. So take a few minutes, chat, and I'll be here if anyone has any questions. Okay, let's come back together as a big group. And if you have any questions, we can make room for that now. And then also, if you heard anything, if anything came up in your group discussions that led you to a question, or anything really interesting that you heard that you want to share, that's all fair game too. So at this point, I'll open the floor. And Ray is coming around with the mic. Thank you, Ray.
So you mentioned early on red lines in curation specifically, and that even if we think we don't have them, we should know what they are before we cross them. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because sure. I don't know if we have them.
Yeah.
I'd like to.
Yeah. So I think the example that comes up a lot is Mein Kampf, right? So that's going to be a red line for a lot of people for reasons I explain. And then there are going to be a lot of people who are going to say, like, you know what, this is historians need that book to write, history of fascism, for example, right? Something like that. Other people, are going to say, like, actually, I don't care, we're not selling it, right? And I think both have their defenses. One that comes up a lot is J.K. Rowling's books. I think that one thing I've heard is some people say, like, look, that feels like banning a book. Whatever I think about her positions, I don't want to carry it. I don't want to outlaw it. A lot of people are going to say, yeah, no way. That's not going to be on our shelves. And then there are some people who say, we do still carry them, but every penny of those sales goes to a pro-trans organization. I think that they're really interesting. There's a good conversation to be had there. So those are some examples, I think.
Specifically in terms of like the J.K. Rowling, we had books that were left over from an event, and we did have something that said, like, we donate to a trans organization, and now we're not carrying those anymore. But it also goes to our curation policy, which I'm working on, of we don't carry large authors. So whether or not it's we don't carry her because she's anti-trans, we also don't carry her because she's a large author, and we like to focus more on small authors who need the representation. J.K. Rowling, James Patterson, who we love, doesn't need shelf space in my 900 square feet store, and she doesn't either. So I can go either way with that, depending on who it is that I'm talking to. But really, it's because we don't like her. So.
and it can all be true, right? Like, I mean, the policy can reflect multiple intentions, I think.
I was looking at code of conduct examples, and I'm looking at in the ABA's one, there's the bookshop Santa Cruz, and they have this code of conduct for audience members. And I was just wondering if you have any insight to, like, how they convey that to audience members, if it's just kind of like it's there on their website and they can point to it if they need to, or if there's any, like, before an event starts they reference it. We haven't, at my store, we haven't really dealt with that too much, but we've had one or two instances where we've needed to, like, usher somebody out. So I'm just curious about kind of using code of conduct for, like, event audiences specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I actually encountered this myself this morning when I was signing up for a nocturnal bug crawl at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. Yeah, it's going to slap. But I was signing up for that event, and there was a code of conduct included that you had to sort of scroll all the way to the bottom and accept and acknowledge before you signed up for the event. That's one way to do it. People also don't read those. I do think that it gives you. I think that it can be, if there are any handouts for the event, it can be there. You can have a poster that is put out for events so that people kind of see it on their way in. There are other things you can do, and I would say that making sure that people encounter it before the event, if it's going to be in place, I think is important, so that you can say, hey, actually, you're violating our code of conduct, which you agreed to in order to come to this event, implicitly or explicitly. So this is your warning, right? That you're violating it. Please, cool your jets until you review it, and then we'll go from there. In terms of removing people, I mean, I think that you have to use your best judgment in terms of safety. Also, approach it from a de-escalatory place. If you need to call someone to help, know who you're going to call. But I was trying so hard not to say it, Lisa. Ghostbusters.
We had to.
It's true. Yeah. Know who you're going to call. Ghostbusters. But yeah, if you think that an event is likely to draw some kind of conflict like that, ideally you would be thinking about security, talking to the publisher potentially about security. If you know that an author's events have been targeted earlier in the tour, think about that as well. But in many cases, I think that if you're asking someone to leave and they know that you can call someone, to have them removed, because at that point they're trespassing if you've asked them to leave and they're not. I don't know if that's legally true 100% of the time, so check local, etc. And none of this is legal advice, by the way. But that, I think, is an important distinction to make. Let them know. At that point, most people, I think, will realize that it escalates to getting someone else involved.
I was just going to add that another place where we make it known, and once again today, I learned something new every time I hang around anywhere near Philomena, because our kind of values and our code of conduct are mushed together, and I can now figure out how to separate them out and make it clearer. But one way that we emphasize our values and our code of conduct in events is that on our website, where we direct people who want to do an event to go look, we reiterate all of that. We say, these are our values. This is the kind of event we do. If you don't think you fit in there, then you probably shouldn't try to do an event here, kind of stuff like that. So that's another way you can kind of get those out there.
Yeah. Thank you, Lisa. That's really, really helpful. And yeah, separating out the values statement and the code of conduct is really important, right? Because they're governing different people's behavior, but they're also inherently connected in ways that are worth exploring.
So one thing that we have done at our store is that we did print out little slips with our kind of more code, like our curation policy, but having that for staff to hand out when like the owner isn't there to come up and defend us is really nice. You can be like, here is like a little bit, here is her information if you want more, but just having something to hand out when you feel vulnerable is really nice to have, to just be like, here is this, you can follow up with them, this is where we stand right now.
Yeah, that's great, a really good point. And in the toolkit, the bottom QR code there are a bunch of other resources for how to have language available to your staff, other ways to just kind of give people a way to deflect if they don't want to be drawn into a particular conversation, or just to help them protect themselves. Okay, if there aren't any more questions, I do want to share one personal bit of news, which is that this will be my last institute at ABA as a staff member. I'm moving to PEN America, which is a literary anti-censorship organization. So I'm still, so it's it's bittersweet. So I see a lot of familiar faces here who have seen it. So many of these. I just want to say thanks for making me feel so welcome at every single one of these, and for coming to so many of my panels. So thank you. And, I've been keeping it kind of DL because I didn't want it to be a distraction, but it's public as of now, as far as I'm concerned. So, yay and boo.
Thank you for listening to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Additional educational resources can always be found on the ABA site at www.bookweb.org. Happy reading!